Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another edition of Against the Odds. So we are on the official countdown to the release of E3 Revolt. Actually, once this video is posted, E3 Revolt would have just went live, which means starting next week, we are going to be exploring some sweet new cards, starting with a special episode. But this week, we are playing Gideon, Champion of Justice, also known as Bad Gideon, the worst Gideon probably ever made, who came out on top of our last poll in a bad Planeswalker battle. It was Gideon sneaking out the victory. So this week, we are heading to Modern to see if we can maximize the potential of Bad Gideon. A quick reminder before we break down the deck: if you enjoy this deck and you enjoy Against the Odds in general, it would be awesome of you if you could take a quick second, click that subscribe button down in the corner of your screen. It's a great way to support the channel and the site for free. So there's not too many ways to build around Gideon, Champion of Justice. This is the second build of the deck. My initial thought with Gideon was, we gotta play a fog deck, and I was like, well, I want to try to not build a fog deck, so I tried to build a deck that didn't involve fogs, and instead use like ghostly prisons and those type of effects, because the way Gideon works, let's talk about Gideon first, it'll make more sense. So the way Gideon works is it can become a creature with power and toughness equal to its loyalty counters, and you can +1 it to give it a loyalty counter for each creature your opponent controls. So, kind of the idea of making Gideon good is you want your opponent to have a lot of creatures, but you also obviously can't have those creatures killing you. So I wanted to have a deck that gave our opponent creatures, and then we could pump up our Gideon, make Gideon huge, and then either exile all the permanents with the ultimate. If we can get Gideon to like 30, 40 loyalty counters, we can exile everything except Gideon, then just beat down with like a 20/20 Gideon and win. Or we can just have a huge Gideon and use it to attack and win that way. So that's kind of the idea of the deck. So my initial thought was play ghostly prisons, other things that keep creatures from attacking, give our opponent creatures, and there's not that many cards that actually do that. There's the Hunted cycle, which, for example, Hunted Phantasm, you get a 4/6, but your opponent gets 5 1/1 tokens. There's a green one that gives your opponent 4 1/1 fairies with flying, and you get a 8/4, I think, for 4 mana. So that was my initial idea. Unfortunately, though, the problem is all the cards that prevent creatures from attacking say can't attack you. So Ghostly Prison says creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature. Well, Gideon is not us, as much as that would be helpful. So what would happen is we would give our opponent a bunch of creatures, we would keep them from attacking us with Ghostly Prisons and those type of effects, and then we would play Gideon, and our opponent would just be like, oh, okay, we'll attack all our creatures at Gideon, and our protection, the Ghostly Prisons and stuff, wouldn't do anything because of how those cards are worded. So it just wasn't working, so I ended up going back to the fog plan, which, like I said, I was hoping to avoid because it seems predictable, but I think that's the best and maybe the only way to really abuse Gideon. So the plan of the deck is to give our opponent creatures, keep those creatures from killing us or killing Gideon, and then get Gideon to a ton of loyalty, exile everything, and then beat down with Gideon. So essential to this plan is the fog package. So we have a bunch of fogs, and essentially we're kind of like a turbo fog deck. Actually, I'm calling the deck Bad Gideon Fog because that's essentially what it is. So we have a massive 14 fogs, and these cards are all fairly replaceable. They each have a little bit of upside, a little bit of downside, but the basic idea is once our opponent gets a huge board of creatures, which they will get pretty quickly because we are giving them creatures, which we'll talk about in a minute, we got to make sure we just fog every single turn to make sure our Gideon stays alive, to make sure we stay alive to the point where we can ultimate Gideon. So Ethereal Haze is kind of the most efficient of our fogs, prevents all damage for just 1 mana, and the key thing here is it lets us play Gideon on turn 5, plus Gideon, and then still fog, so being 1 mana is pretty nice. Dawn Charm has the upside that it can counter a spell that targets us, so if our opponent goes to Lightning Bolt our face, or some other direct damage type spell, Dawn Charm gives us an answer. Angel Song, we can always cycle it. If we get Fog Flooded, we can cycle it, get another card off of it, which is a nice bonus. And then Pollen Lullaby can kind of be a double Fog. If we win the Clash, the creatures our opponent attacked with don't untap the next turn. So that's kind of an additional upside, but I think it's the worst of our Fogs. It has the least amount of upside out of all of them. And then we have some ways to give our opponent creatures. And these are kind of key to the deck because while some decks kind of do this for us, they just play a bunch of creatures and we naturally can plus Gideon. If we're playing a deck that isn't really creature based, just giving Gideon +1 counter each turn, +2 counters each turn, is not going to be enough for us to get to the point of ultimating and doing what we're trying to do. So, we have Forbidden Orchard in Swan Song to intentionally give our opponent creatures and make sure our plussing of Gideon speeds up, gets to the ultimate stage really fast, and can win us the game. So Forbidden Orchard, super easy. Gives us mana of any color, which is nice for mana fixing, but when we tap it, we give our opponent a 1/1 colorless spirit. Normally you don't play this land because your opponent's going to beat you down with the spirits. The good news, though, is we have all the fog, so we can give our opponent creatures every single turn. Eventually they're going to have a ton of spirits, but if they try to attack us with them, we just fog it, and then our Gideon will get to ultimating and we win the game. Swan Song is pretty sweet. It's basically a negate with a little upside since it can hit enchantments. Little downside, doesn't hit planeswalkers or artifacts, so but it counters a lot of stuff. It counters things that would target our Gideon, counter spells that would counter our fog effect, plus it gives our opponent a 2/2 bird, which in our deck is actually an upside rather than a downside, because we want our opponent to have those creatures to kind of forward our Gideon. Then we have kind of the card draw part of the deck, and this is important because our deck is quickly going to get to the point where we gotta fog every single turn, and if we miss a fog one turn, our Gideon's going to die, or we're going to die, and then our Gideon dies with us, so we want to be drawing extra cards. So we have Howling Mine, Temple Bell, Dictate of Kruvix. Essentially, they all just keep drawing us extra cards. Make sure we have a fog, make sure we find our Gideon, so when we have our fog, we can have a Gideon and make it huge and exile everything and win the game. So they just keep us churning through our deck, making sure we have the action when we need it. And then Leyline of Sanctity kind of protects our Gideon and protects us from some stuff that our fogs don't help against. So we have a ton of fogs, but if our opponent is trying to win with Ad Nauseam or win with, I don't know, some other sort of spell, a burn deck that's just throwing lightning bolts at our face, all of the fogs in the world are not really going to save us, but Leyline of Sanctity will. So if we combine Leyline with our fogs, it kind of gives us a little bit of game in matchups where our fogs just aren't that great. As far as the mana base, we get Gaia Reach Sanitarium and Mikukuru, Center of the Sea, as additional kind of Howling Mine lands. More ways to make sure we keep finding the fogs, finding our Gideons, finding what we need to stay in the game. The rest of the mana base, a bunch of duels, in the blue-white, including Celestial Colonnade and Ghost Quarter to help against Tron. One of the things with this deck is our opponent's going to draw a ton of cards because all of our card draw effects impact both players. That means if our opponent has creature lands, they're going to find them. If they're playing Tron, they're going to find their Tron pieces. So we want Ghost Quarters to be able to kind of disrupt that part of our opponent's deck. In the sideboard, we have some negates as additional ways to protect our Gideon. In some matchups, we'll bring them in for Swan Songs if we're worried about artifacts or planeswalkers, which our Swan Songs don't hit. And then we have the good white stuff, Rest in Peace for Graveyard, Stony Silence to deal with artifacts and enchantments, Burrington Forge Tender, another card to save us against burn decks, red decks, Timely Reinforcements gains them some life, and since we're giving our opponent creatures, we're almost always going to get the tokens, because our deck is so focused on that, it's a way we can take advantage of the fact that we're giving our opponent so many creatures. And then Crucible of Worlds, since we draw so many cards, we're going to draw into our Ghost Quarters, so kind of a backup win plan, especially against Tron or control decks, is to get a Crucible down, Ghost Quarter our opponent repeatedly till they run out of basics, and then our Ghost Quarters turn into Strip Mine, and we can just kind of destroy all of our opponent's lands forever. And then a bit more removal, Detention Sphere can hit anything, and Supreme Verdict, just in case we get too many creatures on the battlefield, also can help us win with Gideon. So if we aren't exiling everything with Gideon, our opponent's going to have a ton of creatures, so it's going to be difficult to just attack and win without exiling everything. But Supreme Verdict lets us give our opponent a ton of creatures, get Gideon to like 30, 40 counters where just one hit would be lethal, and then we can Supreme Verdict before activating Gideon, destroy all our opponent's creatures, and attack with Gideon for lethal. So that is Bad Gideon Fog for Modern, and that's our Against the Odds deck for this week. So is this going to work? Yes and no. So I have a lot of faith that we will do well in some matchups. That's kind of the thing with a deck like this. We're very good in creature-based matchups where all of our fogs are relevant. On the other hand, if we run into a bunch of decks that are playing heavy control and winning the planeswalkers, or combo decks that are storming off or something, we're kind of just relying on Leyline of Sanctity and don't really have that much interaction. Yeah, we have a few counters. Swanstong is a really nice main deck addition to help fight those matchups, so we have some chance in those matchups, but creature-based matchups I think is where we're really going to shine. So it's going to depend on what we run into. The other thing with creature matchups is they're going to have creatures to help speed up the Gideon process. While we're pretty good at giving our opponent creatures, we can give them a creature every single turn if we have a Forbidden Orchard. If we have multiple Forbidden Orchards, a ton of creatures are going on our opponent's side of the battlefield. But it still helps if they're playing some amount of creatures too to really speed it up. Because ideally, once we play Gideon, we're hoping that one activation will get it up above 15 where we can ultimate. And in worst case, like 2 activations, we'll get it up enough where we can ultimate and have a Gideon left over with enough power to close out the game in a couple of attacks. So that's kind of the idea. So we really want our opponent to have a ton of creatures, and while our cards can get us part of the way there, we're going to do better in matchups where our opponents are kind of helping us along by playing Tarmogoyfs and playing Thalias and whatever creatures are playing, Lingering Souls and so forth. So I think we'll get some wins with it in our good matchups, but I also expect we'll probably have some trouble in our bad matchups. But I don't think there's many other ways to build Gideon Champion of Justice. It's just such a challenging card to build around, and if you're not giving your opponent creatures and just playing it fairly, it's pretty bad. Like, it just doesn't do anything, and it's worse than every other Gideon. So I think this is the only realistic way to do it. Like I said, I tried to find another way with Ghostly Prisons and stuff like that, but when it comes right down to it, the only place that Gideon is really good is in a fog-based deck like this. So hopefully it works. Keep your fingers crossed. Anyway, that's been our deck tech for Bad Gideon Fog in Modern, and that's our Against Odds for this week. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoy the gameplay videos, and I will talk to you soon.